So, Lysander was right. As always. Stopping to identify the shipwreck was a mistake. And now the storm we've been keeping ahead of has rolled in overhead. Lysander says our only option now is to remain anchored until it passes. And that could take weeks. We were at least able to identify the wreck. It is, without a doubt, the Lazari. In the lower decks we found a single body. That of its captain, Cadwell. I never really had him pegged down as the goes down with his ship kind of guy. It's surprisingly honorable for a privateer. We've only actually been stuck here for a day, but the boredom has very much set in already. Company aboard the Errant is lacking. There's only so long I can spend listening to Schultz ramble about whatever device it is he's working on this time. Not that I would have fared much better on the Vigil. Taylor would be making the most of this opportunity to give me a hard time. So that's why I'm here anyway, writing this. I figure if we really are going to be stuck here for a long time, I might as well make myself useful. You see, the land I come from, the land we left behind, is different. Not like any settlement you or anyone else has ever heard about before. I come from the Serverwide Provisional Republic, or S.P.R, the first and only functioning democratic nation in this entire world. And I believe that for all its flaws, of which there were many, its memory should be preserved, so that future generations can learn from our successes and our failures. So, that's what I intend to do. The story of the S.P.R's rise and fall is a long and very complex one. But I guess if I'm going to start somewhere, it may as well be the beginning. The S.P.R's history begins with a little town on a lake. My former home, Laketown. An original name, I know. Now, Laketown was a small but growing community, situated on the westernmost reaches of the continent. Built on stilt-like foundations fashioned from hardened dark oak, the town consisted of a series of gangplanks and walkways, not high above the marshy waters below. Homes and places of business were built off from these narrow paths, allowing the local populace to live and work without ever stepping foot on land. Perhaps unbeknownst to its founders, this would provide Laketown with a set of unique advantages that would see it become the center of early civilization within the following years. You see, positioned out on the water as it was, and with the only connection to land being via a narrow bridge to a boggy swamp, Laketown was naturally immune to the threat of both monsters and illager raids. Combined with its easy boat access, the town was in prime position to expand rapidly, making use of a network of lakes, rivers, and waterways to become something of a central trade hub among minor fishing communities in its immediate area. With this rapid expansion came a prospering economy, and with newfound wealth came an influx of new settlers. New buildings, homes, and businesses began to spring from the woodwork like the wild reeds in the surrounding marshlands. And with this growth came the need for a change in governance. relying on goodwill and common sense alone can only get a community so far, and as such the people of Laketown decided to appoint a council of guilds to oversee and govern them. Consisting of representatives from every major business and guild, the council ruled over Laketown for many months, with a stern, yet just hand. Under their oversight, the community continued to grow in both size and wealth, with a maritime trade thriving, and expeditions inland seizing new business opportunities and resources. Lumber camps were established in the woods, to the east and south, while scouts traveled even further afield, in search of even more resources to exploit. As expeditions traveled further and further inland, it wasn't long before we made our first contact with the people living there. We quickly came to realize that the world was much larger than we thought. South of the River Phelps, we discovered a settlement previously unknown to us. Celendia. This thriving agricultural community was built atop the high-quality soil of the lowlands, and its people worked the fields, growing grains and root vegetables. Under the leadership of several prominent families, the founding farmers, as they were known, the Celendian people lived simple, comfortable lives. That said, Celendia's economy was otherwise stagnant, owing in large part to its isolated existence. As such, it didn't take much negotiating for the first trade deal to be arranged. Shipments of wheat and potatoes began the journey north to Laketown, in exchange for fish and minerals sourced from Laketown's naval trading partners. Celendian agricultural produce quickly became a mainstay of Laketown's trading portfolio, and the profits it drove sparked a wave of inland expeditions, in search of more communities and more trading opportunities. And they weren't to be disappointed. The lands we had so easily written off as dangerous and barren were in fact teeming with life. Small proto-communities spread for miles in every direction. And with these newfound contacts came an ever-expanding trade network. Shepherds in the central regions supplied wool and livestock, which was used in Laketown to create warm clothes and powerful sails. Meanwhile, sugar and paper originating from merchants in the Far East allowed our trading partners to flavor their food and write works of cultural importance. The world, it seemed, was far bigger than we had first realized, and now Laketown was at its center, at least figuratively rather than literally. But whilst its influence continued to grow, its resources were spreading thin. Projecting Laketown's authority over such a large area was a logistical impossibility, and merchant caravans began to fall victim to banditry miles from the reach of the authorities. As crime only continued to rise, a group in the continent's central regions arose to take matters into their own hands. The so-called Orthanc Bounty Collectors Guild. Based out of a small settlement known locally as Orthanc, the Bounty Collectors Guild was a collective of cast-outs and exiles from numerous Illager warbands. Banded together under the leadership of the self-proclaimed Lord Julian. They had strange names. These less than reputable characters enacted a crude form of brutal frontier justice all across the Midlands. From those willing to pay for this service, they would collect a sizable tithe, and for those that weren't, they would seize it. We're not in valuables, in blood. As the situation around the continent only continued to devolve, it became clear that Lake Town cannot carry on operating as it was. The issues we faced now were different, unique, widespread. Yet this time, we weren't alone in facing them. Because the people of the continent were now bound together. Our many trade routes, the veins of a single life form. An attack on any one of us was an attack on us all. And to that end, the solution to our problems became clear. Reluctant as they were to give up their position of power, Laytown's Council of Guilds saw no choice but to write to the leaders of every major community with a simple proposition. We would unite the people of this world under a single banner, as a single nation, and together we would work to solve the issues that threatened us all. Vague as this sentiment was, it seemed the leaders of our peers shared it in earnest. The Council of Guilds took to their headquarters to draft a constitution, and after several days they formally announced the formation of the Serverwide Provisional Republic. The government that we created took the form of a federal republic. Every major community on the continent formed a state, and each state was to have a representative in the Republic's Senate, a council of peers responsible for running our new nation. Here, senators would vote in elections, propose legislation, and voice any grievances that their state might have. The S.P.R. operated under a series of strict protocols and procedures, defined by the 8 articles of the Constitution. Each article outlined a key tenet or fundamental principle vital to the Republic's governance. The first article, Article 1, officially defined the concept of a state, that being the home region of a single major community and their surrounding territorial claims. Each state was guaranteed the right to appoint a senator, who would represent their state on a federal level. Article 2 formalized the concept of server-wide law, which would be proposed in the Senate and would come into effect immediately if passed. This article also guaranteed every citizen the right to a fair trial. Article 3 established a framework of basic laws that would form the foundation of the S.P.R.'s justice system. Based on the Lake Town Book of Laws, this meant that obvious crimes such as theft and violence were outlawed from the very beginning. Under Article 4, it was mandated that a presidential election must take place in December of every year, with the winner taking office the following January. Any senator other than the previously sitting president was permitted to run, and the candidate with the most votes would win outright. Article 5 was one of the most simple, yet somehow controversial articles of the entire Constitution. Put simply, Article 5 guaranteed the enfranchisement of every citizen of the S.P.R., subsequently granting their senator a vote to cast on their behalf in the Senate. Some states, primarily in the East, took issue with this, owing to the fact that it gave larger states more political power. Article 6 of the Constitution outlined every role and position within the government. The first, and most important position in government, was that of the President, who acted as the Republic's leader and proposed laws for the Senate to vote on. Next was the position of Chancellor, who served as the President's right hand. The Chancellor's main responsibility was running government proceedings. However, they also had some say in proposing laws. The third position within the cabinet was the Chief Justice, who acted as the federal judge and oversaw all court proceedings and sentencing. Under the Chief Justice's authority was the Guildmaster. the Guildmaster had the power to manage and propose the formation of private guilds and companies, provided, of course, they were first approved by the Chief Justice. And the last member of government was the Premier. Unlike other governmental roles, the position of Premier was appointed not by the President, but directly by Laketown's Council of Guilds. Whilst extremely controversial, the Council felt entitled to a small degree of political power on the national scale, owing to their role in the S.P.R's creation. Their control over the position of Premier and its associated powers allowed just that, and this would go on to spark numerous political controversies. The next article is Article 7. This provision handled the somewhat unpopular matter of federal taxation, which it was decided would simply stand at a flat rate of 15 emeralds per state, to be made out to the federal treasury. And the last article, Article 8, established a universal trading standard, based on Laketown's pre-existing system. This was more a formality than anything else, as Laketown standards were already largely in use continent-wide. Article 8 also established a standardized calendar, which defined the current solar year as 1 ADR. After the publication of the Constitution, a total of 9 states formed as members of the Republic. Laketown, Solendia, and Orthanc were of course the first. The 4th state to form, to Laketown South, was Frozen Spires. Built into a mountain valley, the stronghold of Frozen Spires maintained a small population, which quickly became both culturally and politically aligned with its neighbor state, Solendia. In the Republic's center was Longbourn. While small in population, Longbourn held a key piece of central land that would allow it to profit from trade tariffs and transport between the east and west for years. Longbourn was also the S.P.R's main exporter of wool, which was vital to Laketown's industries. The Republic's 6th state formed far to the southeast. The theocratic state of Helen, or Hellenic state, was little more than a religious cult, who worshipped a turtle god of death they called Helen. This seemingly bizarre practice quickly grew in popularity, particularly among the eastern states. In the mountain pass to the east, 2 states were created. The first, the land of Lemon, was home to the Lemonites, a small group living in an anarchist commune. Whilst directly opposed to the concept of both nations and states, the Lemonites joined the Republic anyway to ensure that their voice was heard. At the mountain's peak was Serenity's enclave, which often went by the SCA instead. Isolated as they were high above the clouds, the SCA was mostly apathetic to the day-to-day dealings of the Republic, only involving themselves in politics to support their friends, the Lemonites. The last state to form was Slateport, a wealthy merchant state and major political power among the Eastern Bloc. Slateport's economy would grow rapidly over the following years, quickly rivaling and eventually dwarfing that of even lake towns. The states could be divided between western and eastern states along this line. This border is significant to cartographers due to the numerous cultural and political divides that would manifest between these groups in later years. You can also split the states along these lines instead, which creates a third category of central states. The central states never really had a collective identity, and defining state as central was only really relevant to early Republic mapping, before falling completely out of practice. With the Constitution written and states formed, it was time to create our new nation's first cabinet. As Lake Town's appointed delegate, it was decided that I would serve as provisional president for what remained of the year, with the senators of Orthanc and Longbourn serving as my chancellor and chief justice, respectively. I granted myself the title of Guildmaster, as I intended to make use of its powers immediately. You see, Lake Town's Council of Guilds, to whom I was beholden, were concerned with one matter above all else: the protection and security of Lake Town's trade on the continent. Indeed, this was one of the driving forces behind the S.P.R's creation, and as such, I was tasked with using my newfound powers to establish an authority capable of ensuring this. This authority was to be the Republican Guard. The Guard were a collective of highly trained volunteers, responsible for enforcing the Republic's laws throughout the continent. Easily identified by their azure blue coats, and led by yours truly, the Guard became the Republic's will manifest. Despite being headquartered in Lake Town, the Guard took recruits from all across the S.P.R., from Salendia to Orthanc to as far as Slateport. Besides their more obvious duties, such as launching investigations and carrying out arrests, the Guard were also tasked with several other responsibilities, from providing security to government officials, to establishing camps and checkpoints along major trade routes. In a less official capacity, Guardsmen were also known to escort merchant caravans and convoys headed to and from Lake Town. Once discovered, this caused much outrage among Slateport's industrialists and traders, who were afforded no such luxury. As with all aspects of the S.P.R, the Guard would gain quite the controversial reputation over the following years. In the West, they were hailed as the protectors of the Republic, paragons of its ideals and its virtues. In the East, however, they faced a very different reality. To them, the Guard were nothing more than a tool of oppression, willing to stamp out any hint of disobedience in service of the Laketown politicians that funded them. The rate at which Laketown was acquiring power was starting to worry the other states. First claiming the position of president without an election, and now entrenching ourselves within the Republic's law enforcement. The straw that broke the camel's back, however, was the discovery of the Premier title. Having a federal position, appointed by a state authority, could only ever be construed as corrupt. And once uncovered, there was outrage in the Senate. A vote of no confidence was instigated immediately and passed unanimously, leaving the S.P.R. without a president for what remained of the year. What followed was a period of suspended governance, which saw the rise of petty crime continent-wide. Emboldened by the apparent failure of law and order, thieves and vagabonds began to resurface all across the Republic, while highwaymen took back to the roads with brazen disregard for the law. Perhaps the most significant outlaw of this period, however, was none other than the notorious Sugarcane Bandit. The Sugarcane Bandit made a name for themselves by carrying out a series of daring heists throughout Slateport, employing increasingly elaborate schemes to remain one step ahead of the authorities. The bandits' modus operandi was to target the River Slate, home to Slateport's thriving sugar industry. Every few months they would come out of hiding for a single night, stealing several small fortunes in unprocessed sugarcane, before returning to ground undetected. As you can imagine, this wreaked havoc on Slateport's then still developing economy. And worse yet, the harvest that could be salvaged now had to compete with the black market, with stolen sugarcane making its way around the continent for a fraction of the price. Much time and effort was dedicated to apprehending a thief, but to this day they remain at large. Despite being absolutely reviled in Slateport, the Sugarcane Bandit became something of a folk hero to the rest of the Republic. And stories spread far and wide of the masked outlaw who stole from the wealthy merchant class and gave to the poor. Criminals weren't the only people to feel emboldened by the state of the S.P.R, however. In the Far East, missionaries of the Hellenic faith began to leave their monastery, traveling north and west. The cult-like religion quickly spread to nearby lands, with the eastern states adopting its practices in earnest. Hellenism would maintain less influence in the West, however, gaining some traction in the central states, but being rejected in totality in the far west. Despite how quickly it seemed to appear, the cultural relevance of Hellenism would remain significant throughout the S.P.R's existence. And many historians believe it to be the root cause of all political disparities between the two groups. After several months of what can only be described as organized chaos, December finally arrived, and with it came the first presidential elections. Candidates ran from both Selandia and Orthanc, with support from the other states divided almost equally between them. The election was to be a simple affair. As the previously sitting president, I would conduct the proceedings, calling on the senators one at a time to cast their votes. The tension in the Senate was palpable, and even as the votes were coming in, it remained unclear who would come out on top. That was at least until the Selendian delegate took to the stand. In a shock twist, they announced a staggering 40 votes in their own favor. An, at the time, impossibly large amount, dwarfing the next largest states several times over. Naturally, the legitimacy of these votes was called into question. An inquiry was formed and dispatched immediately, returning several days later with some shocking revelations. According to the inquiry, Selendia's votes were actually legitimate, following a mass immigration drive and subsequent surge in population. However, this recruitment had been done without proper planning, with many of these new citizens having no choice but to live in destitute conditions due to a lack in appropriate housing. To the inquiry and to the Senate, it was clear that Selendia had purposely misled settlers in order to curry political favor. The election was deemed legitimate, but Selendia's senator was tried and convicted of gross negligence, being ordered to pay substantial reparations to the villagers affected. To prevent such actions ever occurring again, an initiative was spearheaded by the Land of Lemon, the Ethical Villager Inhabitation Law. Once passed, this law mandated a minimum standard for villager housing, before allowing its residents' vote to count in the Senate, whilst also creating an independent authority responsible for enforcing this. This removed all political incentive from unsustainable recruitment and would hopefully fix the oversight entirely. The last stretch of the year was unremarkable, as politics died down in anticipation of the new year. Several small local celebrations took place on December 31st, welcoming in the year 2 ADR with reserved optimism. On the evening of the presidential inauguration on January 1st, the so-called S.P.R's comet became visible in the sky. Named after the brilliant scientist from Slateport who first discovered it, the comet was taken as a good omen by the superstitious members of the gathered crowds. And that, give or take a few minor details, is the story behind the S.P.R's creation. While we set off to something of a rocky start, we had still managed to achieve a great deal. The laws and institutions we established that year would serve as the foundations of everything we would go on to achieve. And we had already proven that despite our differences, we could come together when it really mattered, to ensure the welfare of our people. Of course, this is only just the beginning of the S.P.R's story. The Republic had taken its first steps, but before us now lay miles of open ground. The next 15 years would present us with trials and tribulations beyond anything we could ever foresee. From secession, to civil unrest, to natural disaster. But these are stories for another time. As for now, I have to decide how to spend the rest of the evening. You know, in a weird twist of fate, I felt a strange sense of freedom these last few months at sea. I might be stuck here physically, but for the first time in what feels like forever, my choices, however small, have truly been mine alone.